Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest online meeting of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Forestry and Tree Planting. My name's David Lee, and I will be your host for today's event. We are discussing a deceptively simple question today. Is the UK on course to meet its tree planting targets 1 year on from the 2019 general election, when the Conservative Party said it would plant 30,000 hectares of new woodland every year across the UK by 2025, a pledge subsequently adopted by Boris Johnson's new administration and often repeated since? Like me, I'm sure you'll find the phrase 1 year on from the general election rather odd. It is indeed the anniversary of the election on Saturday, but it seems like about a million years ago because so much has happened in this strange and very challenging year. With the start of the vaccine programme, there is real hope, but as we all know, there is a very long way to go. However, on the positive side, technology has helped us all in so many ways this year. And the APPG has used it to continue to host well-attended and hopefully relevant events. I'm sure today's discussion will be as entertaining as those that have gone before. It's a big topic on the table, and we have a great lineup of speakers for you. A couple of housekeeping points before we start. Please, can you mute yourself and keep your camera off if you are not speaking? If you go down to the bottom of your screen, click on the white bar, and either side, don't click the red telephone in the middle or you'll cut yourself off. Click on the microphone to the left and the camera to the right, just so we can see the person who is speaking. Hopefully our speakers as well will do the same when they're not actually speaking, and I'll do the same. I will mute myself and turn my camera off so we can concentrate on the person on the screen. We have had a lot of questions put to the panel in advance today, and thank you for them. We'll get through as many as we possibly can. If you would like to ask a question, please pop it into the chat box, and that is the speech bubble to the top right of your screen. A question or a comment. We can't promise to get through all of them, and priority will be given to the parliamentarians on the call. We'll also be using the polling feature on Google Meet today. I'll explain later what to do, but I hope you will all participate. Just to be clear, this is an open meeting. It will be reported on the Confor website and possibly in the trade press as well. The video will be shared by via Confor's YouTube channel, and we do have some members of the media present today as well. That's enough from me. I will now hand over to Ben Lake to set the scene for our discussions. Ben is MP for Ceredigion, and he is chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Forestry and Tree Planting. Ben, over to you.
Diolch, David. It's great to be here again, and welcome everyone to the fourth virtual meeting of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Forestry and Tree Planting. I'm glad to see we have another good attendance, and I hope that you're all keeping well in these rather strange and difficult times. Last time we met, we had a very lively and informed discussion on forestry, wood and biodiversity. And today we return to the subject of tree planting at a time when there is so much happening around the topic. The Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee inquiry, the inquiry into tree planting targets and whether they can be met, stopped taking written evidence last week. The industry response to the inquiry provides us with plenty of material to discuss today. We've also had the Prime Minister, including tree planting in his 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, which is extremely welcome. And in launching the plan, he reiterated the ambitious target of 30,000 hectares of new woodland to be created across the UK every year by 2025. This same target was repeated soon afterwards by the Chancellor, as he confirmed funding for tree planting in his spending review. However, on the same day as the Prime Minister's announcement, disappointing interim planting figures for England laid out the scale of the challenge before us, and we'll hear more about that from Caroline Eyre from Confor soon. Then just last week, Caroline represented the industry at an event organised by the Oxford Farming Conference, where Environment Secretary George Eustace launched the Agricultural Transition Plan. Now, this is the plan which lays down a roadmap to a new way of funding our rural areas. It was great to see a forester having a voice at such an event. It's so important that all land uses are involved in these big discussions about our rural future, as we must look at land use in a holistic way, and forestry must have a seat at the table. Now, in a response to a question from Caroline, Minister Eustace said that productive forestry had a critical role to play in meeting the 30,000 hectare target. And to use his exact words, we will never get to that kind of area of woodland creation unless a significant chunk is commercial forestry. It's a big part of our plan, end quote. And that was great to hear, but there's still lots of work to do. So we'll hear from Caroline. We'll also hear from Tom Barnes of Vaston Timber, a business working on the ground, who will explain why we need more wood, and from Edward Barker, Director of Natural Environment, Trees and Landscapes at DEFRA, Stephanie Rhodes, the Delivery Director for the England Tree Planting Programme, and Richard Greenhouse, Director of Forestry Services, Forestry Commission, about their plans to push up planting rates. I'm also delighted that we will hear from Jim Mckinnon, CBE, who wrote the 2016 review of the processes for planting applications and approvals, credited with driving up planting rates in Scotland from around 4,000 hectares of new woodland annually at the time of the review to over 11,000 hectares in each of the last 2 years. What lessons does he think we can learn from Scotland and Ireland? And should we be carrying out a Mckinnon-style review in England and closer to home in Wales, where the tree planting rates have been extremely low in recent years? These are all questions that I hope we'll be able to cover, and we've got lots to discuss. So to begin with, I'll hand over to Caroline Eyre, the National Manager for England for Forestry and Wood Trade Body, Confor. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and again, welcome. So I'm going to give you a short overview of tree planting in England, the targets and the reality. So where are we now? So the UK government has set a target of 30,000 hectares, about 75,000 acres in old money, of new woodland planting across the UK every year by 2025, as has just been stated. The Prime Minister included the target in his 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, which of course Confor welcomed. This is a huge challenge for the whole of the country to achieve, and it is unprecedented in recent history. But we believe it is achievable if government works constructively with the forestry industry. However, while some progress has been made, particularly in Scotland, current statistics show just how much needs to change if the UK is going to get to this level of planting by the middle of the decade. Currently, less than 14,000 hectares are being planted annually. 80% of that is happening in Scotland. Too much of our tree planting over the past 30 years has been woodland which will never produce wood. It delivers no income stream for the landowner, therefore is left to the mercy of the threats of deer and grey squirrels. Without the management a young woodland needs to, and it fails to thrive. Confor has calculated that England needs to plant at least 7,500 hectares of new woodland each year if the UK is to meet its overall target. The Prime Minister's 10-point plan coincided with the publication of statistics showing that in April to September 2020, only 763 hectares of land were newly planted with trees in England. It is a big challenge, and we do have problems. We need an urgent review of processes for tree planting applications and approvals, similar to the review undertaken in Scotland by Jim Mckinnon, who we will hear more from later. We need a coordinated UK-wide approach to the 30,000 hectare target. We need planting targets to be clearly linked to delivering other policy objectives. For instance, mitigating climate change, supporting biodiversity, and delivering rural jobs and growth. We need clear targets to use more homegrown wood, which will lock up more carbon. We need to recognise the UK is the second highest global net importer of wood after China, and worldwide timber demand is set to treble by 2050. Forestry is governed by the UK Forestry Standard, which is one of the best standards for environmental land management in the world. There is no appetite in forestry for deregulation. We would much rather see all UK land management brought up to this standard. But our frustration is that even forests which meet these strict criteria for design and site constraints are not permitted to be planted. Why should we import timber from countries that may not have the same high sustainability standards that we do? Finally, we need a joined-up approach, linking tree planting with increased management of existing woodland and greater wood use and a seed-to-mill approach. But as there are problems, there are some positives and some solutions. The regional forest partnership approach is gaining momentum in Cornwall, Northumberland and possibly Devon. Political will is strong, and there is positive support for tree planting from Lord Goldsmith. The Environmental Land Management Scheme is taking shape. We will have the first England tree strategy for 13 years. The EFRA inquiry will shine a light on planting failures, we hope, and the Forestry Commission employing much more resource to help tackle the problem. And we believe an internal review of regulation is being undertaken in some part through the England Tree Strategy development and the England Tree Planting Programme development. But as illustrated, there is a long way to go if we are to meet our planting and establishment targets. We need woodlands to sequester carbon and create biodiversity habitat and places for people, but we also need them to produce wood, to provide the materials for a low carbon economy and to create jobs and economic growth. It's the role of the professional forester to design woods which do all of these. So let's get everybody around the table so we agree which part of the UK is doing what. Learn from Scotland and improve processes to drive up planting rates in England and Wales. Make sure all the regions of England are working effectively to support new planting, and let's build on the positivity to plant. I will now hand over to Tom Barnes. Tom is the Managing Director of Vaston Timber, and he will talk to you today about the need for purposeful woodland establishment and managing more of the woodland resource we have better. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Caroline. As Caroline said, my name's Tom Barnes. I'm the Managing Director of Vaston Timber. I'm a fourth generation owner of this business, which has been processing hardwoods for over 100 years. We sawmill and process a range of British grown hardwoods and softwoods, including ash, oak, sycamore, chestnut, cedar and larch. Most of that goes into the construction and renovation sector. Recently, we launched a product called Brimstone, which is the first thermally modified product exclusively from underused British grown hardwoods. Over 90% of what we produce and sell comes from local woodlands, which makes us a rarity. The infrastructure remaining to process British hardwoods is tiny, and once it's gone, it's unlikely to return. And without the processing chain, hardwoods grown in the UK, all of these new trees we're going to plant, will have no value beyond biomass. Only around 7% of the hardwoods that we use in the UK come from the UK, while about 34% of all sawn timber is actually grown here. And that equates to, we're importing about 7 million cubic meters a year of sawn timber. Now, I'm by no means making a case that importing timber is inherently bad. We need to do that. But I am making the case that there are big benefits on offer if we can tip the balance a little way the other towards homegrown timber and grow more and use more of what we have here. Now, what are the benefits? Using more native wood puts more money into our woodlands and our rural economy. That's simple. It funds more planting and encourages management. And it funds jobs in forestry and jobs like mine in the supply chain. Using more native wood shortens the supply chains, reducing negative impacts and improving resilience. Now, almost every builder's merchant in the country ran out of building timber during the first few weeks of the pandemic. Using more native wood allows us to claim the benefit of carbon sequestration under the Paris Climate Agreement. Using more native wood ensures that the timber we harvest in this country is to high sustainability standards, and we're not offshoring the responsibilities to countries with less stringent regulations. Now, more importantly, I think that using more native timber will substitute other materials and fuels that emit large amounts of fossil-based CO2 and other pollutants. Wood is carbon negative. Now, at worst, it can be treated as carbon neutral, and replacing materials such as concrete and steel and plastic with wood will reduce the impact of building. How do we achieve these benefits? Well, I'm sure Caroline would agree with me when you say, we need to plant more, we need to manage more, and we need to use more. It's that simple. But to succeed, we need to break down political and cultural barriers. I believe that in the same way agriculture and food are intrinsically connected, so tree planting, management, and wood production should be. You wouldn't talk about agriculture without talking about food production. But I do hear and read continuously about tree planting with absolutely no mention of management and wood production. Now, just recently, Central government, the Environmental, Food and Rural Affairs Committee, DEFRA, a whole year of BBC Radio 4 PM programme talking about trees with no mention of timber. I've got to say, it drives me a little bit potty. Tree planting is important, and that's what we're talking about, but it's only step one. We mustn't forget to talk about step 2, which is management, and step 3, which is harvesting. A farmer wouldn't plant any other crop and consider his or her job done. Without step 2 and 3, tree planting, I don't think, will significantly contribute to CO2 reduction targets that we have signed up to. In fact, without management, it's unlikely to produce any kind of meaningful woodland at all. Overstocked, stunted, deer-chewed, squirrel-stripped trees achieve nothing, and in many cases will not survive to see middle age. The famous Oliver Rackham wrote, "Exhorting people to plant trees to sequester carbon dioxide is like telling them to drink more to hold down rising sea levels." Claiming that planting trees alone will solve our climate problem, I believe, is nonsense. And I do think that those in positions of trust and authority and power should stop peddling this misinformation. Trees can do many things, but on their own, they cannot absorb our greenhouse gas problem away. Now, what trees can do is reduce greenhouse gas emissions by producing wood that replaces building materials that are responsible for high levels of emission. There is potentially a much bigger win here than I think is being appreciated. Forest-based studies have forecast that over a 100-year cycle, the overall carbon benefit of a well-managed woodland that produces timber and wood fuel is 3 times the benefit of sequestration alone. 3 times. If you focus solely on step 1, and I'm not saying for a minute we shouldn't focus on tree planting, but if you focus solely on step 1, you miss out on tripling the potential of woodland to reduce CO2 emissions. If you want the triple whammy, then we have to start talking about steps 2 and 3, management and harvesting. Now, from my perspective, management of woodlands is essential. Good quality trees do not grow by accident. And I have personally very few markets for poor quality wood from damaged, distorted, low-grade trees. Woods and trees must be managed to produce usable timber. That's a simple fact. Also consider this, and this is my last point. Poor quality trees end up in short-term biomass, such as fuel and animal bedding. So any sequestered carbon is re-emitted within a matter of days. High quality managed trees produce timber that ends up in long-term products such as construction timber, flooring, cladding and joinery. This wood will remain in situ, locking up the carbon for 50 years or more. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much indeed, Tom, and to Caroline and to Ben. I see some questions already going into the chat box. Just on the point that Tom made there, I don't know whether this will disappear in my background. It probably will. Comfort's manifesto for the 2019 election, which we talked about, was called "The Future is Forestry, Tackling Climate Change with Trees," and made 3 basic points, exactly what Tom said: plant more trees, manage our woods better, and use more homegrown wood. It's a very simple message. As Tom said, it is a complete triumvirate. The 3 have to go together. So thanks very much, Tom, for laying that out really, really clearly. Our next speaker is Jim Mckinnon, CBE. Jim is a former chief planner for Scotland who was brought in by the Scottish government in 2016 to look at how planting rates could be pushed up. As Ben said earlier, at the time, about 4,500 hectares of trees were being planted in 2015-16 and in 2016-17. This then rose to 7,200 hectares in 17-18 and more than 11,000 hectares over the last 2 years. Interestingly enough, about half of the amount of trees being planted in 2018-19 were 50 hectares or less, mainly on farms and small landholdings, so not all huge forests. Jim has since been asked to conduct a similar exercise in the Republic of Ireland. So for some thoughts on what worked in Scotland and what might be applicable to England and Wales, I'll hand over to Jim Mckinnon. Jim, over to you.
Thanks very much, and David. I hope everyone can, if not see me, then at least hear me. Why was I commissioned to do this work? Well, there was a Scottish Government commitment to plant 10,000 hectares per annum from 2012. It wasn't being met, and industry had the view that it was complex and bureaucratic procedures as a key barrier. So why was forestry seen as important? Yes, carbon sequestration, and I absolutely take Tom's point about substitution of much more environmentally damaging building materials. But in Scotland, the economic driver was also very important, because the forestry was worth 1 billion to the Scottish economy and 25,000 rural jobs, mostly in remote rural areas, what we might call Mamba territory, miles and miles of bugger all. But it did actually help stimulate jobs. What was also interesting was that in the early days, when the planting targets were not being made, nurseries had got saplings and they just actually couldn't be used, and nurseries lost a large amount of money. And the mistakes of delivery of the 80s, delivering timber, planting on, for example, the flow country, peat bogs, did lead to security of supply and increasing supply for timber processing. But when you look 20 years ahead with low rates of tree planting, there was a worry about what the future was for timber processing. So there was a lot of support for this, not just from government, but also the industry. So I sought to understand the process. Looking at some of the key things that struck me, there was a lot of concerns about screening for environmental impact assessment. I didn't look at, but I was aware of 3,000 cases and only 2% led to environmental impact assessment. The problem was getting that decision, whether to conduct that assessment or not. Pre-application meetings were a bit of a shambles. The people in what was the equivalent of the Forestry Commission were reluctant to give advice because auditors might take the view that they were favouring something and not being dispassionate. There was also a feeling that the people in the public sector were policing the process, not promoting it. You also had foresters of maybe 30 years experience wanting to talk about soil yields, species, but finding themselves meeting a young graduate who had a degree in biodiversity or ecology, really important, but they were not speaking the same language. And also it was quite difficult to get the statutory bodies to engage in this early process. And that actually was a key problem over consultation, that you couldn't access staff. There was often a change of officer who might take a different view. You would get generic replies, which weren't very helpful. Some individuals had hobby horses, and of course there were delays. So, and finally, on payments, the process was very clunky, with forestry and financial issues actually getting confused. So the way ahead, making sure that for EIA screening, forestry professionals took the decision unless it was a very complex case. Planners do that on a regular basis. Forestry professionals should be able to do it as well. Pre-application discussions, they had to be recorded, the outcome of the meeting, as opposed to people thinking their point of view was accepted unless they were physically thrown out of the room, or I guess in that current situation, the virtual meeting. And trying to get agencies to agree a timetable for responding as well. One of the key issues is community consultation, and certainly for large-scale afforestation projects, that is absolutely vital. And there's a very helpful one-page summary from Confor about the approaches to this. Statutory consultation, we developed or encouraged Scottish Natural Heritage, the Environment Protection Agency, and Historic Scotland to develop protocols for their staff to deal with. We wanted improved management information with targets for processing and separating planting issues from financial approval. We wanted more delegation to local offices, not for the bigger schemes, but if they could approve projects up to 50 or 100,000, then that should be fine. I mentioned the difference in background between the staff and what in the equivalent of the Forestry Commission and the professional foresters for the industry. I looked at the training program for 3 to 6 months. All the training was about personal development, managing relations. There was one technical course in it, and that was about chainsaws. There was nothing about giving these young and inexperienced foresters the skills and knowledge that they need. And I was also quite interested in the idea of large-scale planting over really large areas. The driver for this was my experience in East Ayrshire and South Lanarkshire, where the open cast coal industry collapsed, leaving hundreds and hundreds of hectares of pretty derelict land in areas of great need, but with limited potential. And I thought forestry could provide a good solution there. Has it been successful? Well, apparently so. Planting is now over 10,000 hectares a year for the past few years. I think Ben and Tom mentioned that it's now 11,000. I think they're confident about 12,000 next year. But when I submitted the review, it wasn't, well, here's the review. We then had an action plan developed by the Forestry Commission, and that was then the subject of 2 seminars with the Cabinet Secretary present, who wanted to make sure that there was progress on my recommendations. And the Cabinet Secretary, Fergus Ewing, was absolutely key to this, because what you got from him was strong, sustained and visible political commitment. I can't overstate the importance of this in driving this agenda forward. I also think in Scotland there was a greater sense of partnership working to the same widely understood, shared and tangible objective. So I also think process improvements played the role, but to me the driver was marrying the political kind of drive with processing improvements. I will very quickly talk about Ireland. It's similar to Scotland in terms of land area, climate, topography, commitment to tree planting, but it's completely different in terms of political and administrative context. It's actually run by a department of government, and the minister with responsibility for forestry is actually a junior minister, so he does not carry the clout of a senior minister. The culture is also very different. Farming in Ireland is really important. Farmers do not like to let their land go for forestry. If they do, they're seen as failed farmers. In Ireland, the average area planted was, I think, 6 hectares. In Scotland, it's 40, but you could get schemes of 200 hectares and above. There's some same concerns over delays, but you could demonstrate them because they have very good management information. The huge impact of European environmental legislation, not in terms of whether you conducted an environmental impact assessment, but the way that forestry proposals, not just deforestation, but thinning and also felling could impact on European protected species and habitats. And well, that's all very well and dandy, but in Ireland, there is a third-party right of appeal against these various decisions taken. And so there is hundreds and hundreds of appeals on a European environmental, based on European environmental legislation at no cost to the appellant. And that is causing a major delays in delivering. And the foresters in the department have lacked confidence because they were trained about tree planting. Now they've got to manage this very complex relation between environmental legislation and environmental designations. Planting is also only allowed on 20% of unenclosed land. So the areas that you might regard as used for hill sheep farming here, you could only plant on 20% of that in Ireland. And if you then went down to the lower areas, the enclosed land, you went into better quality agricultural land, farmers were resistant to actually let you plant there. What was also interesting is the conversion rate of approvals to actual planting is much lower in Ireland. It's about 60% because of the delays in actually getting approvals through. Now, I'm not sure about how much progress there's been in the past year in Ireland. Probably not very much because there's a new government, there's COVID, and so forth. But in conclusion, if you want to deliver this, you have to move on from onwards and upwards statements like make America great again, take back control. And if people mention things like we need a vision for forestry, I just recoil in horror because there's a fine line between vision and hallucination. And also it doesn't really help you actually deliver things on the ground. So you need to align that vision, for want of a better word, with a real understanding of process and what are the key problems. But while process improvements are important, they have to be supported by and driven by a very senior political figure who has the ability to make things happen and not see this as solely the responsibility of the industry or the Forestry Commission, but also other key players in the process over which government has got some degree of control and influence. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much indeed, Jim. Some great points there. Be upfront with communities, understand wider benefits, not just environmental, but also economic as drivers for planting. Industry and government working together, absolutely crucial. Having the necessary skills and experience in the right places, in the agencies, and above all else, political will, having somebody who is going to show the leadership to actually drive this through because they believe it is the right thing in both environmental and economic terms. Our final contribution today comes from the people tasked with turning the UK planting commitments into reality. First of all, we're going to hear from Edward Barker, who's the Director, National Environment, Trees and Landscapes at DEFRA, and Edward will then hand on to Steph Rhodes, who is Delivery Director for the England Tree Planting Programme with Forestry Commission. So Edward, first of all, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. And I should also say I have Naomi Matheson on this call, who is my programme director, who's looking after the England Tree Planting Programme. And it's been great to hear the speakers before me. I mean, there's a lot of expertise around this table. And I should start by saying I'm very keen to learn from that, including in particular the Scottish experience and to working with all of you. And I'd also say that, I mean, there's clearly a lot of agreement here. We're agreed we need more trees. There's a lot of political commitment behind that from what I can see. We have a manifesto commitment for 30,000 hectares a year by 2025 across the UK. And there's also, I think, a strong commitment to improve woodland management, which has come up quite a bit already. I mean, as others have alluded to, this is also quite a big stretch from the experience of probably the past 30 plus years. So there's a big task to do in getting to that destination. I mean, I think one of the things that's also come across to me and is very clear from the way in which we're building this programme is why are we doing this? I mean, we're interested in carbon sequestration and achieving net zero. We're interested in enhancing biodiversity through our tree planting programme. We're also interested in creating jobs and green recovery. We're interested in growing a sustainable UK timber market, as Confor was speaking about. And we're also interested actually in the benefits that more woodland and forestry can have for people in terms of health and well-being. So in terms of how we're going about this, I'll talk just briefly about the England Tree Strategy, which again, a previous speaker mentioned we haven't had a strategy of this kind for a while, and it's important. I mean, it'll set the long-term framework for delivering what we're talking about here and giving some confidence to people who might be making the decision to plant trees or improve management of existing woodlands. So we want to get that strategy out. We've got a lot of responses over the summer, over about 18,000, I think, which we're working through at the moment, but we plan to get that strategy out early next year. And we also have additional funding this spring. The government allocated the Nature for Climate Fund, which is a substantial amount of money that will basically add a bridge to the start of the Environmental Land Management Programme. So we are working very closely with our colleagues who are designing the ELM to make sure that the incentives flow from one to the other so people can make decisions today that then stand well into the future, because we obviously want those trees to stay in the ground and grow unless they're being harvested for productive uses. We're also keen to draw in and incentivize more private investment, so it's not just public money going into it. But having those financial incentives is clearly an important part of achieving the target. As I say, since the allocation of that funding and the target, we've been setting up the England Tree Planting Programme this year. We'll use that money to support planting on public and private land and building capacity through this winter. And already, I mean, you may have noticed the recent announcement on community forests starting to ramp up planting. I mean, it is clearly quite a steep path, and a lot of that growth in planting comes a little bit later over the next couple of years. But I think we're getting off to a good start. I'll pass over now, though, for a little bit more detail on that programme and what we're doing to Steph. So, Steph, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steph Rhodes. I'm the Forestry Commission Delivery Director for the England Tree Planting Programme, and I'm going to give you a broad update on how the programme of work to help delivering the tree planting programme ambitions are shaping up. The responsibility for delivering that work is shared between the Forestry Commission and is going to have to involve, of course, a number of partners and stakeholders outside the public sector as well. So very broadly, the way the program of work is getting organized is around 3 main areas of work around delivery and 3 main areas of work around enabling that delivery. In terms of the delivery itself, one of the first areas of focus is the development of woodland creation partnerships. These are intended to be initiatives that will promote the bringing together of stakeholders and partners and supporting regional proposals and landscape scale tree planting approach for woodland creation. They can have focus on a number of areas, from nature recovery to social outcomes, as well as the carbon sequestration. And they're likely to be focused in or around peri-urban areas. That's one of the first delivery mechanisms we're working on. The second strand of work focused on delivery is planting on private land. And planting on private land has an ambition to deliver a new integrated approach of new grants, improved regulation, and improved guidance to increase the uptake of woodland creation and make the experience of deciding and proceeding with creating woodlands an easier one, with a focus both on creating woodlands outside and around peri-urban areas. That area of work is also planning to support local authorities' response to ash dieback. The third strand of work relating directly to delivery is planting on public land, and which we look into expanding the national forest through Forestry England, but also working with other public bodies owning and managing land to to plant more trees. There's a number of aspects that are needed to enable this to progress. One of the one that's been highlighted quite strongly in the previous presentation is the very necessary sector capacity to support, as I think Caroline put it, the seed to meal trajectory. So we will need more people growing trees, planting trees, designing the woodlands and managing them for the long term, as has been highlighted for a number of times in the presentation. So some work to be carried out with the sector together to increase the capacity to a stage when it can support the sustained ambition for more woodland creation in the future. And the last 2 enabling areas of work relate to communication and promotion and engagement. Ultimately, what we're talking about to realize the ambitions in terms of tree planting is land use scale on a very large scale. So we need to convince decision makers, landowners, and land managers that creating and managing woodland for the long term is the right choice to make. So we're going to develop a strong campaign of communication with stakeholders, a strong engagement strategy to reach a wide range of stakeholders. But we are also planning to develop a more targeting strategy around promotion and marketing to existing and new audiences to better articulate and better understand from our perspective how creating and managing woodland for the long terms might meet the objectives of diverse landowners and help them build and realize their own objectives through woodland creation where it is suitable again. That is all I wanted to cover at a really high level on the work we have in train.
Okay, thanks very much, Steph, and thanks to Edward. We're going to move into the Q&A session now. I've got about 20 minutes or so, and I think Richard Greenhouse at Forestry Commission, Director of Forest Services, will also chip in and maybe help answer some of these questions. Lord Carrington, who's one of the vice chairs of the APPG, Lord Carrington, I don't know whether you want to come in and ask your question, which you'd posted in the chat box. If you want to turn on your camera and microphone, Lord Carrington, and put your question, please.
Okay, my remark, as it's not really a question, is that in order to grow all these trees, this 30,000 hectares of trees, per annum, we need land to do it on. And the obvious land that it will take place on is the arable land and grassland that is currently being farmed by our farming community. Now, the government, through the passage of the Agriculture Act, has agreed that there will be environmental land management schemes coming in, which will include planting woodland and forestry. However, the pilots for these elms have only just commenced, if they've commenced at all, and the likelihood of there being any detailed information on how the farmer will make his profit from growing these trees is actually unlikely to enable the implementation of any take-up of elms to plant trees to happen before the beginning of 2024. Now, I think this is absolutely unacceptable, and we ought to be putting as much pressure as possible on DEFRA to come up with the detail. I am a farmer and landowner, and I certainly am not planting trees till I know what the financial implications are. And I would be speaking, I'm sure, for every other farmer in the country in that respect.
Okay, thank you. Edward, would you like to just make some comment on the progress of elms? And I'd just also like to bring Caroline in after that, just on what you think, Caroline, in terms of how elms are shaping up, because I know you're quite involved in all of that. So Edward, first of all, please.
Yeah, certainly, David. And my colleague Naomi may also want to pitch in on this. And thank you, Lord Carrington, for that question. And you're right. I mean, lots of people are raising that issue. I mean, as I mentioned briefly, as we create the England Tree Planting Programme and the various ways in which we're going to use the Nature for Climate Fund, starting right now, to incentivize tree planting up to 2025, we're getting that started. So there will be incentives available before the Environmental Land Management Programme comes in, and over the summer when we had the England Tree Strategy consultations, we had, I remember chairing a session specifically on planting on farms and the interaction between what we were talking about and farmers' other choices and incentives. So we're looking at providing incentives through the Nature for Climate Fund, taking us up to 2025. And we're also working with our colleagues who are designing the Environmental Land Management Programme to make sure that those incentives aren't undermined by and sort of flow through into elm in the future. So I completely understand the interest in seeing more of the detail of the Environmental Land Management Programme, but hopefully we can give some clarity on incentives for farmers in the shorter term before that.
Okay, Caroline, do you just want to say what what you're seeing on the ground in terms of elms progress? What progress you see?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Lord Carrington, an excellent question, and thank you, Edward, for part answering it. The devil will be in the detail. The team at DEFRA are working very hard on elms and the various components. I am thrilled to see that woodland is included, and I think we have to work on that positivity that woodland is included and will be included going forward. But how we compromise on land use and normalise forestry and woodland into the farming operations, I think, is the key to this. We have to have an integrated land management approach.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. Just in terms of the specific targets, so there was a question posed in advance from Mike Ingleby from Bowland Bioenergy in Lancashire. I'm going to put this to Richard and Steph. Mike's saying there's nothing in the recent planting figures that suggests this is going to be successful or easy. Edward said it was going to be steep. Are you confident of achieving the new target, and what is the progress to date? How is the rest of this year looking after 763 hectares in the first 6 months? So Richard and Steph, how steep is the climb, and are you confident that we can get to 30,000 hectares across the UK by 2025?
Hello, Richard here. So yes, it is a very steep trajectory. It's challenging. Everything that Steph described is there to help us get there, obviously working in collaboration with our colleagues in Scotland and Wales as well. Yeah, it is very challenging, but I have every confidence that the programme that's been put together, the work that's been done, gives us the best chance of achieving that target.
Okay, and just an interest, just while you're there, Richard, Jim Mckinnon talked earlier on about the political will. Are you seeing more political will, you know, to plant trees now than we have seen for maybe the last 10, 15 years? It seems to be much higher up the political agenda. Do you sense that there is real determination there to make this happen?
Certainly I do. I mean, right from the Prime Minister, the Forestry Minister, the Secretary of State, the Treasury putting the money behind the promises as well through the Nature for Climate Fund. I mean, we really do have unparalleled backing from certainly from any of my 9 years now at the Forestry Commission, and we've got to make the very most of that. Okay, thank you. One interesting point, we're going to launch our first poll, and I'll tell you how to get there in a minute. 2015 to 2020, the target was very much for England. There was an England target of 11 million trees, which was actually missed. Just under 7 million trees were planted in that period, so we're 4 million short on what was a very, very modest target. Then we moved over to a UK target all of a sudden last year. You know, the UK government, despite the devolution of policy, was talking about this 30,000 target across the whole of the UK, when the majority of trees are being planted in Scotland, as we know. So the first question, if you go to the top right of your screen and click on the triangle, square and circle where it says activities, and then click on polls, you should now see a question that says, does England need a national target for new tree planting as part of this 30,000 hectares? Confor, when it looked at this, Scotland is now saying 18,000 by 2025, very ambitious in itself. Wales is looking at about 4,000 in that period. Northern Ireland, realistically, 500 to 1,000. So Confor's view is around 7,500. But what do you think? Does England need a specific target for England only? No. Should it be about 5,000? Should it be 7,500? Or should it be 10,000? Should we be more ambitious in England and not put so much pressure in Scotland? So if you can cast your vote, again, go to the three dots, click on polls, and you should see the poll launched. And if you cast your vote, we'll see those numbers coming in. So while that's happening, we'll move on to another question. I'm just going to bring in Andy Howard very briefly. Andy planted the largest modern forest at Doddington in Northumberland in England. Andy, I'd just like you to reflect a little bit on the joined up nature of government in this, and just a brief comment on where you think it can improve.
Thanks, David. From Doddington, there's been huge strides in the Forestry Commission side of things. The Woodland Creation Planning Grant, which was learnt a lot from Doddington, has improved significantly. I've just gone through a process for another woodland in England on that, so I think there's been significant progress there. Perhaps where it's really lacking is in the follow-on mechanisms. So we do schemes in Scotland, and for example, if we have a change to a contract variation in Scotland, there is somebody within the local Conservancy office who deals with it, sees it through, is a point of contact and enables us to get it delivered. In England, it disappears off down to Bristol or wherever, it goes off to the RPA, and there just isn't that continuity. And the staggering thing on Doddington at the moment is that the RPA can't and won't pay us out. We're waiting 7 months at the moment. And quite literally, I'm not making this up, this is genuinely what they said, they do not have the mechanism to pay us on the contract. So there is not a facility within the RPA system to pay the countryside stewardship contract on Doddington. And to me, that's just ridiculous. You can do all the hard work at the front end, but if you can't actually deliver on the back end, then it just doesn't give any confidence.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Jim Mckinnon, I'd just like you to come in here. How easy was it to kind of join the dots in Scotland? How joined up with the dots in Scotland when you did the review, and where did they need a bit more joining?
Well, actually, I think they were joined up, but maybe quite loosely at the start. But I think as we went through the review, industry saw that the government was serious. The professional foresters saw that government was serious. That seems to me to be was quite important. So there is a sort of common purpose. I mean, just a couple of things in what I've heard so far. One was Lord Carrington's point about the business case, which is absolutely critical. But I would also make the observation that if you're trying to achieve, is it 5,000 or 7,500 hectares, I don't think you're going to do that with small farm forestry schemes, however desirable they may be. I think you have to get much bigger chunks of woodland. And in the kind of the arable areas of England, I think the pressure would be on for hardwoods, rightly so, on native species, broadleaves. And the commercial return on these is actually very, very long term. And many farmers may not see a return at all. So it strikes me that, having listened to comments about partnerships and guidance and Tom's point about not getting money through, that you really have to focus very rigorously on the process to make sure that you get these blockages unblocked. And I think there is a clearly welcome political commitment. But if you were to ask, is it Zach Goldsmith who's the Minister for Forestry? You have to get someone who actually puts their political imprimatur on this. You can't just say, well, the government's committed, the PM's committed, the Treasury. You need to get someone of sufficient importance to really drive this forward. Someone who can really keep the foot on the pedal to make sure that actually the targets are being delivered, and being able to step in and get things moving if there's any delays or blockages.
Okay, Tom, very briefly, Tom Barnes, as a practitioner, do you feel things are kind of joined up? Do you think it's that this kind of joined up nature of government is a challenge in delivering planting?
I've got to say my expertise is not in the planting, but certainly from where we sit, there's nothing joined up about it at all. But then, you know, as was pointed out, the sort of hardwood and specialist softwood part of the market is very different to commercial conifer plantations, and it's very fragmented. Supplies come mostly from private sources, private estates, and only a very small amount comes from public land. So it definitely doesn't strike me as being joined up. But as I say, on the planting side, I'm not really an expert.
Okay, and what do we need to do, Tom? One of the questions again that was asked in advance by Martin Glynn is this idea of a more positive view of forestry and the whole chain of forestry. This is a big question. This is a whole conference in itself. I want you to answer it in 30 seconds.
Okay,
you know,
well, I have some interesting numbers I prepared, which actually I stole from my good friend Gabriel Hemery to demonstrate it. In Scandinavia, there are thousands of trees for every person. In the US, there's about 700 trees per person. In France, there's about 182. And if you could do a pop quiz now, I'd ask, how many do we think there are for every person in the UK? And it's about 47. So you then got to ask yourself, well, there's so few trees about that actually people, I think, have become disconnected. And what you might describe as wood culture, an understanding of woodlands, landscapes, and how they actually work has been lost. And you only have to look at Forestry Commission polls from the general public as to how they perceive the woods. And generally speaking, they would like them just to be left alone and protected. And I don't know if anyone could bear or was lucky enough to see the new environmentalist Nigel Farage making some movies lately with his new level of knowledge about forestry, criticising the Woodland Trust for felling some diseased ash in their woodlands and calling it environmental destruction. And my point is that you know, we need to, number one, start talking about it. And it comes back to people at high level admitting that forestry includes chainsaws, felling, it involves killing some squirrels and some deers. You know, there's some things that people don't want to talk about, but have to be spoken about. If we don't, that void will get filled with you know, maybe well-meaning, but with ignorance, and it's not helpful at all. So, you know, I think we need to start discussing it. It needs to become normalized, as it is in France, as it is in Scandinavia, to think about a forest and think of it as a hive of activity. And in fact, You know, we should be criticising the Woodland Trust if we don't see things happening in the woodland, not if we do see things. But there's a massive change of culture that's needed and a massive change of perception. But that has to start at the top. And we have to stop just talking about tree planting and protection in isolation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tom. Just on the poll, majority of people saying 7,500 hectares by 2025. Quite a few people saying we should try and get to 10,000. 3 people don't think there should be a target at all. So I'm not sure. We could speculate where those votes come from, but we won't do that. I'm just going to move on. Caroline, I'm going to come to you. Very briefly, is 7,500 in England possible by 2025? And a question from Simon Lloyd at the Royal Forestry Society: what would a Mckinnon style review in England tell us that we don't already know? So is 7,500 hectares possible, first of all?
Yes.
Right, okay, that's good. I like short answers. Why?
Yes, if we take into account all of the issues that we have, the challenges that we have in delivering it, and act on it now. And question from Simon. Yeah,
what would a Mckinnon review tell us, a Mckinnon style review in England tell us that we don't already know?
That's not the point. I mean, we know what needs to change, but I think it has to come from almost from an independent. Yes, Forestry Commission are undertaking internal reviews, but the Mckinnon review was short, sharp, and gave some clear recommendations that would be very useful to do within England.
Okay, so that was a short, sharp answer and a call for a short, sharp review. Ben Lake as chair, quick question from you for Jim Mckinnon, just about Wales, Ben.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm just interested to know whether Jim thinks there are any lessons from his work in Scotland or Ireland that might be particularly relevant for the situation in Wales.
Thanks for that, Ben. Yes, I do think that there are sort of parallels and similarities. I mean, Wales, like Scotland, is a relatively small country. I think you can get people together in a room and move forward in a way that is much more difficult in the larger land mass of England. And I think you can readily identify a politician with sufficient oomph to lead this. You can look at the processes, and I think the point that Caroline made there about you do need someone to review the processes rather than think that they're okay. So I think Wales and Scotland have got advantages of scale and connectivity on a personal and political level that could actually drive this forward. So I do see quite a lot of similarities. I don't know enough about the Welsh system, but I think there's some program called, is it Glaister, I think it's called, which apparently, well, I heard was reasonably successful. So I think there are definitely parallels, and you know, I think Wales and Scotland are not dissimilar in terms of topography, and I think that you could achieve quite a lot in Wales. I mean, I think looking at the figures, Wales is significantly underperforming at the moment.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim. I'm going to say that we probably need to move this to a half-day conference in the early part of 2021. We recognise that there is a little bit of momentum growing here behind the idea of tree planting, but there are some enormous debates as to how it's actually going to happen and how we get there. We've heard some really good contributions today, and I'm really, really sorry for all the people who've posed questions that we haven't been able to get round to. But I do hope that some of the things that Jim Mckinnon said about Scotland can be learnt in England. It's really interesting to hear what Richard said, that he is really sensing that real kind of political will getting behind tree planting. And we do have a very, very busy year ahead with the EFRA inquiry due to take evidence in the early new year, the tree strategy to be published, and more great sort of discussions at the APPG in 2021 as we do plant more trees, because we have to, for reasons that we've heard, for the green recovery, for rural jobs and growth, and also for climate change. A personal thank you from Neil Cuthbert and I, who've put together the APPG programme this year, to everybody who's supported it with your attendance and your contributions. We'll be in touch again in the new year, as I say, possibly looking at doing a kind of longer event to really dig into this in the detail it deserves. And particular thanks to Chair of the Group, Ben Lake, for his unstinting support in what's been a very challenging year. And Ben, a few final words from you.
Well, thanks, David, and thank you to all the participants for an excellent discussion this afternoon. It's clear that there's a lot of work to be done, but it is starting to feel like there is some real willpower from everyone involved to start planting many more trees. The challenge will be keeping up that momentum and to start taking the actions that will allow new planting to happen at scale, whether that is a Mckinnon-style review of planting rules and regulations in England and Wales, agreed targets, greater cooperation across all parts of the UK, or indeed more resources for the agencies to make planting happen. In truth, I think, as Tom pointed out, we need all these actions and more, really. But I do feel optimistic that we are really moving in the right direction. I'd like to thank Confo for organising another excellent event today, and thanks to Caroline, Tom, Jim, Edward, Richard and Steph for their contributions. I'd also like to just particularly thank both David and Neil for all their help throughout the year in organising these fantastic all-party parliamentary groups. When the COVID pandemic first hit, many APPGs would have worried that we may not be able to continue our work stream for the year. But David and Neil have stepped in to make sure that we've had a really good year of APPG meetings, and I really want to thank you both for helping me as well. Thank you all for listening in, and I'd like to wish you all a very Merry Christmas on behalf of the All-Party Group, and a Nadolig Llawen, as we say in Wales, and I look forward to seeing you again now in the new year. And I hope that at some point during 2021 we can meet up in person again. But for now, Nadolig Llawen a blwyddyn newydd dda.